Welcome all. We're so glad to have you tonight. We'll give people a few moments to log in and get situated, and then we'll get started. Welcome. All right. Well, for the sake of time, we'll go ahead and get started with some basic overview and prayer and introductions, and then we'll turn it over to Father Aaron for a good portion of time for him to have the opportunity to share with us on this great topic. So welcome. My name is Noelle Collis DeVito. Bethany, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Bethany Fail. I work at the Institute for Pastoral Initiatives here at UD, and I do, I don't know if I said this already, but I do the digital media for the IPI.
And I'm Noelle Collis DeVito, and I work in curriculum research and development. And we're just really excited to be here together tonight to give this wonderful webinar and allow people to have the opportunity to really focus on the importance and our call as Catholics to be missionaries in creating a peaceful world for one another, particularly in this very polarized environment in our nation. So tonight we'll be focusing on the Church's mission in a polarized world, which is this wonderful book written by Father Aaron, and we're thrilled that he is willing to be here with us to share. But in order for us to get started, I'd like to set a few ground rules. We have disabled the chat this evening just because we want to make sure all of the questions are coming through from one space. You will be able to access the chat and get information from us, but you will need to field all of your questions through the Q&A button, which should be at the bottom of your screen. It's one of the features that you can utilize to ask questions. And one of the great things about that feature is that when you ask a question, if somebody else has a similar question or they really like the question that you asked, it can be upvoted, which makes it a really great opportunity to elevate some of those questions and move them up the list a little bit so we can get through all of them and make sure that the priorities really get answered well. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started with opening prayer, and then we'll hand it over. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. A reading from the Gospel of Matthew. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the clean of heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are they who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they insult you and persecute you and utter every kind of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward will be great in heaven. One of my favorite prayers is the prayer of St. Francis, and I think it really exemplifies those beatitude values. And it's something that I think is really appropriate for this evening. So we're going to go ahead and pray that, and then I'll be handing it over. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. For those who are just joining us, I want to go ahead and welcome you again and just remind you that you'll be entering any questions that you have in the Q&A tonight. We have disabled the chat for the attendees for that reason, so that we can keep those questions focused in one area. And then I would just like to go ahead and introduce our wonderful speaker for this evening. Father Aaron Wessman is the Vicar General first vice president, and director of formation for the Glenmary Home Missioners since 2019. He has a Ph.D. from the Catholic University of Louvain in systematic theology and is a guest lecturer at St. Meinrad Seminary and School of Theology. Father Aaron serves on the editorial board for Review for Religious and the advisory board for the Conference of Major Superiors of Men Religious. He gives lectures and publishes regularly on the themes of Christianity and polarization, including his recent book, which we're going to be discussing tonight, The Church's Mission in a Polarized World, recently released by New York City Press. He serves 2 prison systems in the Cincinnati region of Ohio. All right, I want to go ahead and hand this over to Father Aaron. I'm going to stop my share so he can enable his, and we look forward to hearing from you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Noelle. Thank you as well, Bethany, and to everybody who's out there for joining us this evening. It's an honor for me. I've been just so honored by the support I've received from the University of Dayton, not only around my book and also ideas around coming to speak at the university to take part in this event this evening, but also what Dayton has done for us in Glenmary. So we've had men studying there. We have a person studying there currently. And so that means a lot to us in Glenmary for the formation and all of the enhancement for our mission that has come from the University of Dayton. So give me just 1 second. I'll share my screen and get the presentation rolling.
And while we're getting that set up, please don't hesitate. If you have questions as we're progressing, put those in the question and answer chat right away.
Great. And Noel, could you give me a thumbs up? Can you see the presentation okay? Excellent. Very good. So I look forward to speaking perhaps about 40 minutes this evening with you all, and then having some time for some questions and dialogue. So as Noel mentioned, please bring those forward, be thinking about them. If you've engaged with my book and you have questions about it specifically, bring those forward. If this is the first time you're engaging this material, I love the questions. It always helps me to think through the material myself as well. And we had that wonderful prayer as we entered in. I would also like to begin with a prayer, as I think you can't do wrong with having more prayer, right? Especially in the moments we're living in. And this is a particular prayer that has been special to me as I've been going around the United States over the last, I guess, about 2 years now, talking to different groups about the theme of polarization and how it relates specifically to us as a people of faith, also to how it relates to people of goodwill. I've kept kind of coming back in prayer to the image and example of Jesus. And in the process of that, I wrote this prayer, a kind of a prayer for unity. And it means a lot to me because I think it helps for me to center where I want to be when I'm thinking about this theme. And as I'm, struggling with perhaps in my own life, some of the negative effects of polarization, I think it's just really important as well because it sets up what I would argue to be what might be a real important spirituality for us today. And I'll keep coming back to this in the presentation. I think it's important for us as a people of faith to focus on what dispositions do we need to engage in a polarized world? What spirituality? What is Jesus inviting us? And so I think that this prayer contains that. So I'll pray this slowly. And if you want to pray with me, the part here, which you'll see, which is underlined and also in bold, feel free to do so together with me. So just pause for a brief moment of quiet. Lord Jesus, in your life, you crossed over to the outcast. Help us to be one. In your teaching, you commanded us to love our enemy. Help us to be one. Before your supper, you washed the feet of those who would deny you. Help us to be one. Before your sacrifice, you prayed for unity. Help us to be one. On the cross, you brought together what had been lost. Help us to be one. In your death, you touched those in darkness. Help us to be one. After your resurrection, You returned to those who had abandoned you. Help us to be one. In pouring out your Spirit, you made the church the sacrament of unity. Help us to be one. So where I'd like to go together in the next few minutes or so is to actually look at three parts. And so I'm going to begin to talk about my own journey with polarization. So how did I get into this theme and why? And I hope what stands out is that I'm not a person who's kind of standing outside of the fray of the challenge of polarization as a priest, as a Christian, as a family member, as a person who belongs to a religious community, which is the Glenmary Home Missioners. I myself am affected by polarized culture and continue to try to wrestle with what it means to live in a culture that has all of this toxic polarization around. And so I'd like to share my story just to say that I am continuing to seek to try my best to kind of do what I can to be the leader and the disciple that God desires me to be, living in the times we're living in. And then I'd like to look at the second part, which is, what are the real big questions that led to the book, that have emerged out of the book, and that continue to be questions that I wrestle with in my own research and as I talk to groups and listen to people all over the United States. What are they facing and what are they concerned about, and how are they wrestling with these big themes? And especially, how do we view these themes through the lens of our faith and the resources that are given to us from the very rich tradition that we have, not only as Catholics, but as Christians in general as well. And then I'd like to put forth some considerations for moving forward. So in that, I'm going to talk about what is my approach to this topic and this subject, and what do I think can be helpful. And then on the other side, I'd like to look at what it is that the wisdom of the saints can provide to us. I think one of the most important things today is that we imagine a different way of being, a different way of responding than sometimes the culture that's around us. And the more we can cultivate this, what I might call a Catholic imagination or a saintly imagination, I think the better we'll be at responding to the times in which we're living, and doing so, I think, as Jesus would perhaps consider us, would invite us to consider doing in our own lives. So to begin, my own journey with polarization. So I was ordained back in 2012, and my first assignment as a priest was in East Tennessee, actually, in two of Glenmary's, the missionary group I belonged to, in two of counties in East Tennessee where there had never been a Catholic church before. Glenmary went there, as we do, and we try to establish the church and bring the gifts of Catholicism while living in the presence of the people there and building relationships. And it was a really wonderful assignment for me. I loved it, and being an associate pastor is really a blessing in many ways. I loved being part of the Diocese of Knoxville, where I was. And then about 2 years into that assignment, I got a call from my superior, and he said, we would really like you, Aaron, to consider pursuing a Ph.D. in systematic theology. And they said, we would like you to go over to Belgium, to the Catholic University of Louvain. And so you can actually see pictured there the very kind of popular, very well-known library of the Catholic University of Louvain. And this library has a very special connection to the United States and the Catholic Church here, because after World War II, this library was bombed out during the war. And after the war, actually many, many Catholic institutions, parishes, schools gave money and books to rebuild this beautiful, beautiful place, which is there. So this is a special place in my own heart. And there's actually some really good ice cream that you can find around this place. So I oftentimes frequented this and took in the architecture. So back in 2014, then I traveled over to Belgium and lived in Belgium for about 4 years. And it was really, really a blessing for me. And, if you've had a chance to go to Belgium before and visit, you probably will be able to relate to this. If you haven't been there, I highly recommend it for a number of reasons. And I think one of the great blessings of Belgium is they have these wonderful things called waffles. Okay. In Belgium, they don't call them Belgian waffles. They just call them waffles. And they are so amazing. They drench them in dark Belgian chocolate. And it's a waffle that you actually eat with a spoon because it is so moist and delicious and delicate. I must have had 1,000 of them while I was there, which is probably why when I came back to the United States, my doctor almost fainted when he looked at my cholesterol numbers. So I really had to go a little bit of a diet after that fact. But nevertheless, I ate a lot of waffles when I was there, and I highly recommend them. another great blessing that Belgium provided for me was a thing called Belgian beer. Now, because I was there, I had to take part in the culture, right? So normally I would have avoided this situation, but I'm in Belgium, so as they say, when in Rome, do what the Romans do. When in Belgium, do what the Belgians do. The beer is amazing there. So they have actually been brewing the beer with recipes that are sometimes 1,000 years old, right? So like 4 or 5 times older than our own country itself, which is just a remarkable thing. All that's gone into the process of brewing these beers. So it was a wonderful thing. So between the waffles and the beer, it's amazing that I actually got some research done working on my dissertation, but I did. And it was wonderful. The other thing that Belgium provided for me was actually a reprieve from what was going on back in the United States. And you can imagine being in Europe, being in a new culture, having a chance to study, to work on a Ph.D. I immersed myself in Belgian culture, art, architecture, the church there, my research, building friendships with people who are studying wonderful and amazing things, and just investing myself. And so in a sense, I wasn't really engaged with what was going on back in the United States. And so then right around 2017, towards the end of that year, my superior called me up and said, we would like you. It seems like you've probably been having too many waffles and too much Belgian beer. We really think you should come back to the US to finish writing your dissertation, which, trying to be obedient as I am, right? I said, okay, no problem at all. I came back to the United States and took on a pastorate in Eastern North Carolina, where I served in 2 places, at Holy Spirit Catholic Church and St. Joan of Arc. And it was amazing. I loved it. I had a chance to work with some wonderful people. I had a chance to write my dissertation. But when I got back to the United States, it really became apparent to me that something had changed since the time that I had left. And I mean, it was just as real as like this desk that I'm pounding on right now is hard. That experience for me was so tangible, was so real. And what I'm speaking to here is that it seemed to me that something had changed in terms of the increase of negativity and the toxic polarization that was happening in the United States. It could possibly have been that I was away for a while, that I had had this reprieve. Maybe I had changed when I was over in Belgium. But I came back to the US and I thought, oh my gosh, what in the world's going on here? And I saw it in different places. I saw it in my extended family, for instance. I remember seeing extended family members like sharing posts online and on social media. And I thought, well, this just doesn't seem like the person that I know them to be. I mean, these are loving people, good people, and then it just doesn't match up with who I know them to be. And then what they're sharing is kind of hate-filled and vitriolic online. And so I'm like, this is just really strange. And then, I realized like within my own family, at times we were real short with each other. People were saying things about the political climate, and I thought, well, this is interesting because in some cases, people maybe wouldn't even share stuff about the political scene, but now they were, and it just tended to be kind of what I would say to be uncharitable or unhelpful. I also heard from a lot of friends of mine who are engaged in either in ministry as Protestants or in the Catholic priesthood. And time and again, folks were saying, I'm so exhausted. I feel like I can't do anything right. I'm being blamed in one instance for supporting this particular party. And in the next instance, right away, I'm being blamed for supporting the other party. I have whole groups of people who have left my church because they say, I cannot worship with somebody who voted for fill in the blank. And they said, I've never encountered this before. So I thought, oh my gosh, this is really intense. So I kind of went on living my life. And then I realized I was having a conversation with one of my confreres. And I said something that was very uncharitable in a discussion that we were having. And I didn't know where it came from or what was going on inside of me. And I walked away from that moment and I just simply asked the question, what in the world is happening? How is it that the culture of polarization is now affecting me too? I thought I could stand outside of that, but I was being pulled and sucked into it, as I think many good people were, and being influenced in ways that they felt bad about, but they didn't know what to do about it. So kind of being somebody who enjoys research, I kind of started studying the theme of polarization as a hobby. I mean, I was a pastor of 2 places. I was finishing my dissertation, and then I was elected to leadership in my community in 2019. So it's not like I had a lot of extra time, but I was really interested in trying to figure out what in the world is happening in the US. And so as I had started doing this research, I got a number of invitations. The first one started out actually at St. Meinrad Seminary and School of Theology to give a keynote address there, where I applied some of my research from my dissertation to the theme of polarization. And that was really one of the first talks and really one of the first times for me thinking through intellectually the problem of polarization and giving a talk on it. And from that, a number of invitations came to give retreats. And what I found when I gave these retreats was that so many people had been touched by this challenge. I would have people coming up to me regularly afterwards in tears. And they would say, I don't talk to my own daughter, my own son anymore. People would say, I had a falling out with a friend of mine and we had been friends our whole lives. And we do not talk to each other anymore because we came to a disagreement around politics or around some type of division that was happening within the church itself. And I remember in the midst of that, recognizing this, how meaningful this was to people to think about this from a faith perspective and try to grasp a hold of what was going on. And a number of people finally said, you know, Father Aaron, this has been so helpful. And I was really humbled by that. They said, you really, really, really should write a book on this. Well, I thought, my gosh, I'm really kind of busy and with all these other responsibilities. And then I remember there was an elderly woman, and I think she was close to 90. She had a walker and everything. She came up to me at one of my presentations at the end, and she kind of started walking towards me, you know, with her walker. And I didn't know what she was going to say. And I thought she looked like she would say something really serious. And she pointed her finger in my face. And I was like, oh man, I was getting a little nervous and I'm going to get a mouthful. And she just said, Father Aaron, you will write a book on this. So no option, right? You're going to do this. And so I took that as like a strong encouragement of the Holy Spirit. And so kind of like recognizing how people have been affected by this, knowing myself how I continue to be affected by it, I decided to start putting some of those points that I'd come up with my own research to the book. And that's the book that Noel mentioned and that you can see here in this next slide. My computer is freezing up a little bit, but this is the church's mission in a polarized world. And in all honesty, I've been humbled by the feedback I've gotten from people on it, and that really means a lot, because I think sometimes, especially as a priest, you put a lot out there with homilies or writing, and you're not sure if it's sinking in and really helping. But to hear from people to say, like, this has saved relationships for me, this has helped me in my own faith, like that really means a lot. And I understand for sure that this is just a small contribution to what is really a huge problem and a huge challenge. But nevertheless, I'm going to try to tease out a few of the insights from the book and perhaps take it in a few different directions in our remaining time together. So what are kind of some of the big questions that, you know, have emerged from my research and from this book, and that people have been raising to me in my discussions and dialogue with them? Well, the first, and I think one of the most important and probably one of the most worrisome is really this. So why is our political, our cultural, our ecclesial, and we really can't separate these out very neatly today in the US, why has this situation become so ugly, vitriolic, and even negative? Certainly we've lived through divisive times as a country. We've seen this within the church too. But if you look at the statistics and if you study the research, we will see that what they would call negative polarization has really been on the rise for the last 4 to 5 decades for sure. And what a lot of researchers say, there's a rising demonization of the other. So if you're from another group, another culture, another background, another part of the church, is that people more and more see that other group as actually not just wrong on ideas, but actually being less than human, as being even perhaps demonic itself. Some of the research on this would say that 80% of people who consider themselves, you know, self-identified as a partisan from one party or the other, 80% of each party have unfavorable views of members of the other party. So that number continues to rise. And what is also very worrisome is that roughly 30%, again, on both sides of the political spectrum, 30% of people see the other party as having less than human characteristics. And so that's alarming, because we know historically when one group has seen another group as being less than human, that oftentimes has not ended well for us as a species, as a race, as human beings. So we should be very concerned about this rising demonization. Another thing, as a people of faith, we consider the church, and this is a beautiful statement and a beautiful theology, the church is the sacrament of unity. Wow, what a statement, right? So this is the place that we believe that when people look upon us as a people of faith, they should see what it looks like for people to be united with God and with each other, especially through the sacrament of the Eucharist. What a beautiful thing. The church is all about communion, communio. And so the church at the Second Vatican Council said the church is understood in many ways, and one of them is it's the universal sacrament of salvation. It is the sacrament of unity. So salvation is about being united. All across of St. Paul's letters, right? We hear him saying to the communities, please, please do everything you can to stay united. And they had their own problems with division, right? Around the liturgy, around how to treat each other, around social economic differences, around gender, around class. And Paul kept saying, please, please, your identity is in Jesus, and that identity should unite you, and is the most important identity that you should maintain, even more important than your political identity. I think it's important to recognize that Jesus, right before he went to the cross, he could have prayed for anything. And in that high priestly prayer that we find in John chapter 17, what is it that Jesus prays for? That they would all be one. What an amazing prayer, and a thing for us to think about today that really touches me to my heart as well. And so I think the question for us is, do we as Christians feel the weight of our obligation to be people of unity? Unity isn't just like one aspect of who we are. It is central. It is central to who we are. And which is why when we live in polarized and negatively polarized times, we can feel polarization working against the very essence of the church, if you will. Those marks will always remain, but we have to try to cultivate them as Christians. You know, I believe, I love Catholicism, so I love being a priest. I'm so grateful for the gift of faith. I love my Protestant brothers and sisters wonderfully, but I love Catholicism. I love the richness of our tradition. I love the diversity. I love all over the world, you see these many forms of Catholicism being lived out in vibrant ways. What a great thing, right? I love the ancientness, right? If that's even a word, of our tradition, right? It's just the antiquity of our tradition. It's amazing, like how we have inherited this beautiful, rich tradition. But sadly, I think polarization sometimes, as it works itself through society and down into the church, and sometimes as in the way that the church responds, I think we are sometimes diminishing that tradition individually as ourselves. One of the images I love to hold up is the ocean, right? So I think our experience of the faith is like walking out into the ocean. And the ocean is the whole tradition of the church, right? And I can only really experience the water that's around me, and that's great. It's life-giving, it's refreshing, and we should really enjoy it. But we should also recognize that there's vast oceans that I'll never, ever in my whole life probably be able to contact and encounter, and rejoice in that being the fact. And it's okay to have my personal preferences and experiences, but not to reduce the ocean only to that which is around me. The other thing, we have this great bookshelf in our novitiate house. So it is a huge shelf, and it's filled with all of these writings from the church fathers. And I've looked upon that shelf and I've said to myself, I think I'm kind of an academic, you know, maybe I try to play one in movies, right? So I think I will never, ever come to read all of the wisdom that is contained within all of those books, right? So our tradition is so vast, so rich, we can hardly touch it. What I hear oftentimes, though, and maybe you've encountered this as well, people will say, well, you're only Catholic if, and then fill in the blank. And oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, the fill in the blank is if you practice the faith and see Catholicism as I do, okay? And I think that is putting a burden on others, which is an unnecessary burden, because of the richness of the legitimate tradition and expression of the church is that polarization sometimes, it'll influence us to want to kind of reduce that richness. Another important thing to consider, you know, people are looking at us. Absolutely, they're looking at us. I've encountered many people who've said, you know, we're not even Christian, but we're looking to you as Christians, right? They look to us to be an example in this time of hope and of unity, but sometimes real and ugly division exists even within our specific parishes where we belong, right? Between ourselves as Christians and in our country. And, you know, an interesting thing I heard from somebody, one of my presentations, she stood up at the end and she raised her hand and she said, you know, I'm studying theology at a very prominent, and I'm not going to name the Catholic university, but a very prominent Catholic university. And she said, at times there are such bad divisions within the Catholic theologians themselves that at Mass, when we have the sign of peace, we won't even shake each other's hands. And I thought, oh my gosh, you know, these are Christians, right? This is the context of the liturgy, and this is how bad it's gotten. One of the things that I sometimes recognize in dioceses and in presbyterates, and I hear from bishops as well, is that there are generational divides, there are liturgical divides, there are theological divides, there are parochial divides. But one of the things that breaks my heart is I think we're not finding a way to talk to each other, to just have a conversation like, where is it that we have differences, to disagree better, and then to say, well, look at all these other ways in which we find unity, and to find ways to learn from each other. But sadly, we're not finding, not necessarily finding the avenues to talk. Another important point is, and I think if you can walk away with anything from this evening, and this is the thing I keep coming back to with many groups, and I hear from people that this is significant, and it is the following. When we are in a polarized culture, when we form groups, when we are under stress, when we are nervous, when we're afraid, when there's uncertainty, it's always easy, and we're even kind of deep in the recesses of our brains and in the feelings we have. There is this sense where we want to lash out and blame the other, and I hear this all the time. I'll give presentations, I'll go through my whole thing, and it'll be the first hand that shoots up in the air, and the person is, their face is red and they're sweating, and I'm like, okay, oh my goodness, getting kind of ready, trying to, remain curious myself and wait for the comment. And they usually say, Father Aaron, I really like what you have to say. I think it's wonderful, but I just don't think you get it, okay? You don't understand. It's those people over there. They are the cause of all of our problems today. They are the ones that need to change. And I recognize the feeling. I know where they're coming from. But ultimately, as the research suggests, and as I've looked at in my own life and in my own writing, by blaming the other, we don't oftentimes reach the conclusion, the effect, the goal that we actually desire, which is greater unity within our society, within our church. The most important thing we can do in a polarized world is not say they need to change, but ask the question, how do I need to change? How have I contributed to polarization? How do I need to examine my own conscience and think about what is it that Jesus is inviting me to consider today? The last couple of observations here would be the following. Jesus says in the scriptures, not just to love your friends and those that do good to you, but love your enemies. And to be honest with you, on many days, I wish he didn't say that, okay? I mean, very honestly, I'd rather just try to love those who are good to me, which is sometimes hard enough in itself. Jesus takes it a step further and he says, no, actually, if you're going to follow me, you need to love your enemies or your perceived enemies. And that means those we might disagree with politically, those who might seem repugnant to us, those who we might have a hard time understanding, those who we perhaps never engage in. Because of that, because of our unfamiliarity, they become something greater in our imagination and kind of more threatening. Jesus doesn't say, put those aside, don't worry about it, don't love them. He says, no, you've even got to love those folks. The challenge in polarization is that oftentimes we wish not, we're not even concerned about loving them. We actually wish harm on them. And we see these numbers again rising in our context where people who think that violence is necessary in order to accomplish political ends today, those numbers are on the rise in both parties, And if we think we're immune from this in the church, I have heard, and there are articles written on this, where people will say, that group of priests, those older priests, that other group of the people who are practicing God, well, we just need to wait for them to die off. Okay, because then the church will be good. Or people will say about the younger priests, well, I just wish that they would leave and start their own church and let us do the things we need to do. So again, kind of the wishing of the harm on the other is so common today, and yet Jesus is inviting us to something more. I also think it's important to note that, we have been invited, and this is so important as missionary disciples, to bring the gospel to all people. And Jesus says to all the nations. He doesn't just say to those who think like us politically, those who look like us, those who live in the same place, but he says to all the nations. And one of the great, great, great temptations of a polarized culture is that we silo. We remain where we're comfortable. And all that's very understandable, and it's actually related to who we are psychologically. But we just gather around those who are like us, think like us, and that reinforces who we are, which in many ways can be good. It's okay to get support and to have more stabilization in our identity. But we have to find ways to keep going out, to keep pursuing the other, to keep crossing over, as I argue in my own book. So those are some of the challenges, some of the questions, and many more could be raised, and I'm interested in others as well. But just to kind of point us in directions now with the remaining minutes we have, to how do we go forward? So to first look, what is it that I've tried to take as my approach as I've looked at this research and as I've presented? The first thing I would say is that I almost never approach this topic as in a partisan way. So what do I mean? I'm never in a position where I'm telling people how they're supposed to vote. A lot of times in certain conversations, we do need to talk about what to think about policy and perhaps even who might be the better candidate to vote for. That's really not my interest. And in fact, that's not what I feel called to at this point. I actually think it's more important to think about how we are supposed to be treating each other as we try to navigate polarization. So it's about, what are the dispositions? What are the tools we can use? What are the practices so that we can engage across all of the plurality that exists, not just in the world, but also in the church, where there are a lot of different ideas floating around, and it doesn't really do us any good to disengage. So how do we stay engaged? How do we cultivate dispositions or even habits or virtues, if you will, to engage the world around us? Another important thing, it's so easy to get caught up in our moment. It's because that's what's most immediate to us, right? It's that political candidate, it's that event that just took place, it's that debate that just happened, it's this person that just said something, inappropriate to me, and that can consume us. And I know that to be the case for myself as well, right? So again, I'm not immune to this. But almost all the researchers who look at polarization and the approach I take is they say, take the long view. So step back a bit, try to be a little bit objective and say, how have we gotten to the place where we've gotten today? So to kind of look at 5 or 6 decades of how things have developed in the United States, and we come to realize that many of the reasons why we're polarized didn't come about because people set out to make us more polarized. A lot of it has to do with cultural developments and how things have changed and shifted in the United States, in our political parties, how technologies affect us, how media has changed. And I look at that in my book, and I won't get into any detail now, but just to say, it's good to kind of take a breath and step back and try to okay, so what happened? How did we get here? And I think that can provide us a perspective to navigate these times. I also think it's really important as a people of faith to unite theology with the social sciences. And this has been one of the most exciting and I think important things. I think if I've done anything in the book, it's this. I've taken insights from our rich theological tradition and brought them into conversation, or bridged them, if you will, with the social sciences, especially with a lot of social psychology. So there's been some major studies done on group dynamics, intergroup behavior, how we respond as a default when we're within groups, how we tend towards an us versus them mentality, even when it's like superficial, unimportant things, and we're into 2 different groups. Oftentimes we'll look across at the other group and begin to see them as the enemy. So we're interesting as human beings. Our groups are really important for us. They have been in our development as human beings, historically, they've been important for survival. So it's just important to know what is going on in group psychology, as well as what is going on in the study of conflict resolution. There's a lot of great research that I try to point to in conflict resolution to try to unite theology and the social sciences together. And finally, it is sometimes a temptation to become cynical they talk about there's an exhausted majority today, like 70% of people who are just said, I'm done with politics. And I would like to argue that we as a people of faith don't have the luxury to remove ourselves from politics. In fact, our tradition says, no, we really need to stay engaged. Why? Because politics is really about people making decisions about how we want to live. And if we have something to say about how we should try to live as Christians, which I think we do, especially how we are to treat the less fortunate, which I think we do, we have to stay engaged. Now, politics doesn't just mean being part of a political party. It doesn't just mean casting a vote, even though those can be important things. It means engaging on all these other ways around us, being involved civically, being involved in organizations, in communities, in our parishes, trying to work locally, but to remain hopeful, And in the midst of it, I would just like to raise up the very important fact that because you're here this evening, because you've come to this discussion, because you're listening, you are part of a movement that is happening in the United States right now, all over the place. And I can say that because I've experienced it personally myself. Good people as yourselves saying, I'm concerned, I believe I can do something, I would like to do something, and here's what I'm going to do. As they think about this and reflect upon it and share and pray, things are happening, and we should remember that. We can sometimes be dominated by the negativity which is in the media culture, but things are happening in a very, very good way all over the United States. And I want us just to remember that that's the case so that we can remain hopeful and not be overly discouraged. So I love to talk about the saints. I think the saints provide us this new imagination. They provide us with good groupthink. Okay, the saints are like, I'm going to give myself to this group of people who've lived the way, and we know that these people can help us and affirm us in what we might do in a polarized world. So I want to just point. I can't get into all the details of the lives of these saints because of the fact that the sake of time, but to point to a few saints, and if you want to research more, you can look at my book about them. You can also just look up these saints themselves. But these saints were people who encountered the challenges of polarization throughout different times of the church's history. And I think they provide so much wisdom and insight for us now. So I'm just going to point us in a few directions, and hopefully that they're interceding for us right now and with us present as the great cloud of witnesses as we're discussing together. So the first is actually servant of God, Dorothy Day, a great American holy person, a wonderful woman of the 20th century. And I think she reminds us in all things to seek to be Catholic first, and then partisan maybe later, okay? And what do I mean by that? So Dorothy Day was heavily involved politically. Before she really kind of gave her life to Christ through Catholicism, she was a nominal Christian, but it wasn't that influential and important to her. And she was involved like within the anarchist movement, the communist movement. She was around people who considered themselves liberals. I mean, she was all around the milieu of politics, and she was super, super smart, super intelligent, very, very bright, great writer, very zealous person. But when she gave herself to Catholicism, she gave herself to the whole tradition. And she recognized that the Catholic tradition was to be the tradition and the identity that would be the most influential to her in her life. So she would still be engaged politically, but it was through the Catholic lens and through Catholic social teaching and through her faith, such that that was the primary way she saw herself. Statistically today, there's a lot of research on this. Catholics oftentimes reflect the values much more of their political party than they do the richness of the Catholic tradition. And so I think Dorothy Day just invites us to think, you know, am I able to embrace the fullness of that tradition as I engage, as I help the poor, as I'm involved politically? Perhaps we can be involved in a partisan way, but are we challenging the party we belong to so that it reflects more clearly the values of who we are as a people of faith, which is not an easy thing to do, but I meet a lot of Catholics who are trying to do that, and I give them a lot of credit for staying in the struggle. We had that great prayer by Noel at the beginning from St. Francis. And so praise the Lord, St. Francis is appearing again. I write about him in my book. Francis, I think, invites us to seek to engage the other. rather than destroy the other. There are so many vitriolic and ugly and negative appeals that are being made today that the other politically, the other ecclesially is a terrorist, is a battle enemy that needs to be destroyed at all costs. And that rhetoric is strong, it's influential, and it is motivating. But I think it can detract us from being the Catholics we're invited to be. And I wrote a whole chapter on this in the book that I refer people to, which I think is very important, looking at the culture war mentality. But Francis is important because during his time, Christians were at war with Muslims during the Crusades. And I don't want to say there's a one-to-one correspondence between that time and now. So I'm certainly not saying that. But I think there is an analogy here. And Francis imagined a different way. So when everybody thought the only way was to build fortresses and to go to battle one with the other, Francis said, I actually think Jesus is inviting me to cross over, to engage in dialogue with the other. And he did that. So he crossed as a humble man, dressed as he is here, through the battle lines, crossed into enemy territory. Everybody thought he was going to die. He thought he would be killed, for sure. And he walked into the presence of the Sultan, as pictured here. He sat down and talked to the one who most people thought it would have been impossible to talk to. They had a dialogue, and it said that Francis and the Sultan both walked away better people because of it, and that the Sultan even considered himself giving himself to Jesus and was very intrigued by the life of Jesus. I think Francis invites us today to see differently and to respond differently. Another great saintly example, St. Thomas Aquinas. And one of the great things about Thomas is the following. If we can imagine, it's hard for us to imagine this, but the church was dominated for 1,000 years by Neoplatonic and Platonic philosophy. You just really did not bring in a whole lot of other philosophical traditions into the church. Like this was it, okay? Then the church started to gain some access to the work of the philosopher Aristotle. And we would think today, oh, no big deal. So let's look at it. What's going on here? No problem. Well, that was anathema. In the academy, you really did not work with the works of Aristotle, especially because they were coming to the church primarily through those who were Muslim who had translated the text. But Thomas was a man of great generosity and great intellect. And he said, I'm going to engage truth, goodness, and beauty, no matter where it can be found. Whether that's in the person who looks repugnant to me, whether that's in the one who you don't want to deal with, I am going to remain open. Thomas is an intellectual giant, and he remained open to the work of the philosopher Aristotle, even when it meant he risked being cast out of the academy for doing what he did. I think today he is a great invitation to us to look across to the one who seems to be different and say, where is their truth in what they're saying? Can I find value in what they have to offer? Can I learn from them? Can I listen to their story? Can I find what I might be able to take from them into my own experience to grow in truth and goodness and beauty? Another saintly piece of wisdom for us today, pictured here, Pope Francis. One of the most important things that we've been hearing from Francis today is to think about this idea of synodality. And sometimes we might think synodality is real complicated, or I'm not sure how to get engaged, or maybe we've had mixed experiences of it. I've had a very good experience of synodality myself in my community and other places. And I think what Francis invites us to say is look at the tables around you. What rules are you setting for who comes to those tables? Should you perhaps change the rules to let different people come to the table to engage together? And I think this is so key because in a polarized world, we like to make very rigid and strict rules about who we associate with. But synodality invites us to say, let's be flexible with these rules. Let's open them up a bit because there's got to be an engagement. And there might be a group that somebody says, oh, I can't engage them, but maybe God is calling me to engage them. And if I'm going to do that, I've got to adjust my rules and literally sometimes invite them to a table, maybe to a meal. And again, try to have a conversation, try to understand and see the humanity back and forth, and tried to relate together. And the final saint that I'd like to hold up here is Blessed Franz Jägerstätter. And oftentimes in a polarized world, some people will critique some of what I've said, and they say, oh, it's all just all fluffy stuff. You know, this bridge building thing, it's all lowest common denominator. You're watering down Catholicism. And, you know, I'm not doing justice to some of the critique, but I'm kind of, you know, playing the advocate here, right? So they'll say it's just not tough stuff. But actually, those who work in this field of polarization say, actually, no, there are legitimate moments in engaging the other, especially once a relationship has been established, where we also have to be able to share what is true from our experience as a people of faith. We have to be able, in a sense, to stand up for where there's an injustice. We've got to find ways to do that while remaining curious, remaining engaged with the other. But again, there is that prophetic role that we have to play. And Jesus himself did this, right? He would engage, and sometimes he had to challenge those who were in front of him. But even as we challenge, can we still love? And that's what Blessed Franz Jägerstätter did. So he is facing the rise of Nazism in his country. In his little small town, there are people there, good people that he knows to be friends, who are turning to support the Nazis. And Jägerstätter goes into the midst of these people he knows. He listens to them. He has a drink with them. He engages with them. But at some point, he has to put down his foot and say, listen, this is where in my conscience I have to stand. I have to stand up against what is happening within our country, against Nazism, against fascism. And I have to put my foot down. And so I think even as we engage in a polarized world, is finding the way in prudence to also say, look, here's where I'm at. I'm ready to walk away and think about this some more. Let us engage at another time. But it is very much okay for us to find ways again to speak the truth, as we say, in charity. So that brings us to the end of the conversation. So I appreciate it very much. And now we can have perhaps some dialogue and questions. I have some prepared questions, Noel, but perhaps there has been some coming from the group. So maybe I'll stop sharing my screen if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. And I've got a couple of questions here, or even just maybe some thoughts to expand on. The first is, religious groups have traditionally fostered parochial siloing. They have often supported an unjust status quo. Dorothy Day often emphasized the prophetic aspect of our faith. She challenged the status quo in a very political way. And this person says that they're glad that you brought her up as a model. Is there any other thoughts that you have on that?
Yeah, and so I just gave a talk recently at the University of St. Thomas School of Law, and it was to a group on restorative justice and healing. They have a great group out there in Minnesota. And I had been reflecting to myself about the need for human beings to have places where we can go that do reinforce our identities and help us to understand who we are. And I think that's what parish life can be for us. You know, we find a parish a lot of times in a diocese that fits our taste of Catholicism, let's say. And we go there because it lifts us up. I mean, life is tough. We live like in liquid modernity. Oftentimes we feel like our identities are being kind of watered down and dispersed. And so we go to the parish to meet people we love and then to receive the Eucharist, to rebuild that identity. But it can't stop there, right? And so parishes can become parochial in the bad sense. They can become silos. But I think most parishes, good parishes, are trying to say, like, let's be reinforced here, but always to be sent on mission, always to go out, always to challenge what is needed in charity, and then also to, like as I said, also then to readjust the rules that we have. And all parishes have like kind of can have a country club mentality. But how do we like make this a welcoming place, a hospitable place for others? And that doesn't just mean, you know, like sometimes people say, well, we don't have open communion, but it means opening the doors to people and loving on them and greeting them and saying hi and showing ways that people can get involved and offering to folks, you know, if you'd like to become Catholic, this is the process of doing that. So there's all this kind of vibrancy that can take place. But I do think we need the balance of both identity stabilizing structures and places, but also then to be sent into the storm, as I use as the image, if you will, from the book. So thank you. It's a great comment.
Wonderful. The next that I have says, you speak about the war metaphor that has been identified with our Catholic youth mission in the past. I'm thinking of those of us whose elementary faith formation, particularly in preparation for the sacrament of confirmation, was we are an army of youth flying the standard of truth. We're fighting for Christ the Lord, and the cross is our only sword, our earth's battlefield. How do we engage those of us educated with this warrior complex for being a Catholic into the new metaphor or direction you are inviting us?
That's great. So I don't know for sure the background of the person who wrote that question. It might indicate a little bit of their generation, and I have no idea. Although we study our founder, Glenmary's founder, Father William Howard Bishop. His period was the post-World War II period. And when we read his thought and reflection, it is infused with a lot of war imagery, because that was so dominant in people's lives during that time. And in different periods of the church, there has been this utilization of the metaphor of war. So I'm not denying that in any way. I just think that today it's important to recognize that this metaphor might be a little bit problematic. And I think I go into a lot more detail on that in the book, which I kind of point people in that direction. I would just say to cultivate the imagination of by using the saints, who I think provide, again, a different way of being, a different metaphor, but also to utilize the images and metaphors that Jesus himself uses. So I talk about the metaphor of the incarnational movement. So Jesus provide, as one of my more intelligent friends, more intelligent than me friends, who's a theologian, says, Jesus is the metaphor in a sense, which is kind of an interesting thing, right? In a sense, it's kind of like saying he is the sacrament. But Jesus provides this metaphor of crossing over. He sees the outcast, he sees the creation, all of us, right? And rather than distancing himself as the Son of God, he actually unites himself more intimately, which that really goes against the war metaphor, because the metaphor of war says create distance, create silos, create fortresses, lob bombs from a distance, keep yourself safe, see the other as an enemy. And Jesus's movement is risking it, martyrdom, right? Moving close to the potential threat and loving those. And he does that with the demoniac. He does that with the leper. He does that even with his political opponents by crossing into Jerusalem and moving intimately close to them. So Jesus is a different kind of metaphor. He also offers us all of these really powerful metaphors. I mean, you see the prodigal son behind me, right? That's a metaphor, right? So we are to be like the loving father, even if somebody has gone astray politically, whatever, ideologically, we've all gone astray. I've gone astray. We are to see the person returning and run to greet them with open arms, as the Father does. I mean, and who of us hasn't needed that in our own life as well, right? And the final metaphor, I think, will be to look at the metaphor of the Good Samaritan. You know, here this guy has been, like we'd say, robbed, ransacked, on the side of the ditch in a bad place. You know, and maybe some of our ideological counterparts, we might say they've been intellectually robbed, let's say. Well, maybe we have too, but that's a different story, right? But what is the Samaritan? The Samaritan goes in the midst of the person and cares for them and works with them and provides an abundance for them, not even expecting anything in return. So I think kind of thinking about what are the rich metaphors of the gospel that we might replace the war metaphor with to go forward.
Wonderful. Thank you. I did have a friend recently share that when they envision that story of the Good Samaritan, they often think of people that they're more in line with being the ones that pass them up on the side of the road. And I thought that was really, really beautiful. And then the one person that you would not necessarily want to associate with or might make you feel the least comfortable is the person that is your saving grace, which I think kind of flips the narrative a little bit.
It sure does. And the outsider, like as many social psychologists will say, Jonathan Haidt is a great one on this. He writes about it. The outsider oftentimes can be a great source of inspiration and truth for us, because they'll ask the question that we never thought to ask because we have our own assumptions and biases. They actually will make us smarter and probably more solidly within the truth itself. So they're a great gift, the outsider is to us.
Yes. Wonderful. Well, I have two more, and then we're going to, I think, go ahead and wrap it up. And people are welcome to stay on for longer if they want to ask more questions. But for the sake of other people that are on the webinar, I want to make sure we're being as timely as possible. But the next question I have is, do you have any suggestions for approaching disinformation in our culture today? What to do when trying to have a bridge building conversation with someone who deeply believes that something is true when it is in fact not?
So this is a wonderful question, and it comes up a lot. And so I would point people to the book called, I think it's called How Minds Change. And the name of the author is slipping my mind right now. So that's interesting, right? How Minds Forget too, right? So How Minds Change is really good. And the author talks about the theory of persuasion. And he says that, in fact, if you run into a situation where you're encountering somebody who's kind of coming at things with different facts, it really doesn't do any good to try to like argue with them and say like, well, your facts are just wrong. Here are the real facts, right? Because oftentimes we have different ways we trust different sources, and there's a lot of dynamics that go into that. That person would say the best thing to do is to start asking about their story. So get them to begin talking about, okay, so like you've talked to me with facts on tax policy. Let's use a really boring one, right? So tell me your story. Like, how did you come to believe that tax policy should be this way? Now, all of a sudden, you've got the person stepping back and you're not arguing about one fact or the other. They're saying like, oh, now they're telling their story. And what's happening is you're building a relationship, because the relationship really matters, because trust really matters. And there's a real lack of trust, particularly the intergroup dynamics. So you start building that trust with them. You start listening to their story. And one of the things about the book that the author suggests is to say, okay, so you believe X about tax policy. How strongly do you hold that belief? From 0 to 100, 100 being the most strong. And let's say they say 50. Then you say to them, okay, why not 100? And so then you get them to say, well, that's interesting. I don't know why that, and then so now they're backing off of, and they're really thinking about their own thoughts and why not 0? Has there ever been a time in your life where you've actually would have been 100? What got you to be a 50? So what you're doing is you're really exploring a person, and you're actually being a gift to them, and other people are gifts to you if they do this to you as well, because you're helping them really think through their thoughts. And many times, I think for many of us, I'll say this with myself, we really haven't developed too deeply the thoughts we have about particular perspectives, because there's so much to it. And so this is, again, another way to look at that. So I highly recommend that. It's been a really helpful book to me, and these kinds of things have worked in my own conversations.
Wonderful. Thank you. We appreciate that. So, and we'll actually be diving into some of that a little bit next week
Oh,
when we
excellent.
bring in the dialogue zone. I'm actually a trained facilitator with that, but we'll get into that later, and I'm going to hop on to this next question. So you mentioned Pope Francis and a term that maybe somebody didn't catch. What was it? And further explain. And I think it was probably synodality.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that one of the themes that'll be kind of one of the lasting effects, if you will, of the Francis pontificate is going to be his emphasis on synodality. And synodality, in my humble kind of way of understanding it, is really bringing people together from various backgrounds, different places, ages, ranges, generations, ideas, having a setting, a table, a forum where people can share their story, share their experience of Catholicism, share their experience of life, because it's for people who are non-Christian as well. And then listening to each other. And in the context of that, all of this is pointed towards deeper solidarity, so deeper love and communion amongst those who are part of that synodal process, so that we might be sent on mission to try to deepen the experience of the kingdom of God in our midst. So that's kind of that process. So it's the coming together, the sharing, the listening, and then the movement out into the world. That is the synodal process, and that has been happening actually in the world for a number of years now in very formal ways and informal ways. And I would just say my experience as a single person who's been involved here, seminaries are changing because of this culture of synodality. Religious communities are changing. It's not that it's never been there before. It's just part of the church going back to the beginning, but we're finding new expressions of it, ways to deepen our understanding of it, how to talk about it more. It's changing parish structures. It's also changing my own work as a member of a religious community and a leader in the community. So that would be the word that I emphasized.
Great. Thank you, Father Aaron. We really appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen one more time. I just really appreciate you having the willingness to come and join us today. And I want to share that Father Aaron will actually be joining us here on campus at UD. And here's a little ad. We'll be posting this on our social media, and it should probably already be up on our website. But he'll be joining us here in Bull Theater at the University of Dayton on Thursday, October 10th at 7 p.m. if anyone would like to come and meet him in person. And we are just very excited to be hosting him. Campus Ministry will be taking that on, and we're very grateful to have the opportunity to meet you. And then I also wanted to share briefly that our next session and our final session that we'll be having next week, same time, same place, is with Tiffany Hunsinger and myself. We're both facilitators for the Dialogue Zone here at the University of Dayton. And dialogue is a great strategy. It gives you some very valuable ways to do this bridging that Father Aaron is talking about, which is really wonderful, really wonderful techniques. And it is a way in which those conversations in the spirit and synodality are happening. It's happening through dialogue, which is very different than discussion or debate. And that seeking to understand others, similarly to how you mentioned in that book that you suggested a second ago. So I am really excited to be able to facilitate that last part of our series to kind of bring all of these pieces together and to help us move forward in breaking down some of that polarization that we're experiencing here in our world. So we just want to thank Father Aaron and let everyone know that we're really grateful that you joined us tonight, and we hope to see you next week. We will be sending out the video of this and the PDFs of that PowerPoint presentation, so you can look at that and review it. And if you have any questions or anything, feel free to send them our way. All right. Thank you, and have a great night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.